Okay, so good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Welcome to the Palaeoverse Lecture Series. This lecture series is focused on software development and methodological approaches in paleontology, with the aim of promoting the use of new tools in the field and to give researchers a platform to showcase their work. With this series, we're hoping to shake up the usual type of lecture by having a mixed format with time dedicated to the presentation, demonstration, and discussion of software or method presented. Typically, these sessions will run for about 50 minutes in total. I'll be running this series throughout the year, generally on the last Thursday of each month, unless they overlap with the holidays. Now, if you're interested in presenting a new method or software you have been developing or implementing, please feel free to reach out, as we're always happy to hear from the community and looking for speakers. But before moving on, just a few quick introductions. My name is Lewis Jones, and with me today I have Erin Dillon and William Gertie. The three of us are on the core team of Palaeoverse, an organization aiming to bring the paleobiological community together to share resources, reach agreed standards, and improve reproducibility in paleobiological research. Now, if you want to know more about Palaeoverse, please check out our website and GitHub organization, which I believe the links are being dropped into the chat right now. But that's all from me for now. I'm going to pass over to Erin now, who will give you some helpful tips and instructions for this webinar, and Will introduce this month's speaker. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the seminar. Over to you, Erin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lewis. So as Lewis mentioned, the format of the seminar will consist of a talk by our speaker, followed by about 10 to 15 minutes at the end that will be dedicated to Q&A and discussion. My fellow hosts and I will help field your questions during this period and moderate this discussion. Please note that the seminar is being recorded and that it will be made available on the Palaeoverse YouTube channel and on our website. However, we will stop the recording before the Q&A period in case you would prefer to not be recorded. So before we get started, I'd like to quickly point out a couple of useful Zoom controls at the bottom of your screen. You will find a Q&A button. And you can use this to submit your questions to our speaker, and we'll either read these out or call on you during the Q&A session. There is a raise hand button. So alternatively, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you and invite you to open your microphone so you can speak. There's a chat function. So currently you can only chat with the hosts and panelists in case of technical difficulties, but we'll allow you to chat with everyone during the Q&A session. And then finally, there's a closed captions button that you can turn on and view the transcript at any time. So I'd like to highlight a couple of ground rules. Our aim is to cultivate an open, respectful, and inclusive environment during this lecture series where we can all learn from each other. So in mind, we ask that you please be respectful and kind when engaging with the speaker and fellow attendees, particularly as you ask questions and interact with others in the chat. Any form of harassment and inappropriate behavior will be grounds for removal from the webinar platform. And then for more information, please refer to the Palaeoverse Code of Conduct, which will be found on our website, and I believe a link will be put in the chat now. So with that, I will pass it over to Will to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Lewis and Erin, for getting us all up to speed on how the lecture series works. Today, I have the great honor of introducing our speaker, Dr. Natalie Cooper, a merit researcher based at the Natural History Museum in London in the United Kingdom. Natalie's research sits at the interface between macroecology and macroevolution, with the overarching aim of understanding broad-scale patterns of biodiversity. She uses cutting-edge phylogenetic comparative methods alongside an array of data types, including morphological data from museum specimens, phylogenies, ecological interactions, geographic range maps, and fossils to address a wide range of evolutionary and ecological questions. Her group's current research spans macroevolution, ecology, conservation, and social science, working across both living and extinct taxa, including fishes, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. In addition to applying advanced analytical approaches, she also critiques and develops phylogenetic comparative methods, contributing to the refinement of the tools used to study biodiversity across deep time. We're delighted to have Natalie with us today with her talk titled Hack-a-thons, What, Why, and How to Run Them. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Natalie Cooper to our virtual stage.
Hey everybody, and thanks for that introduction. It's always reminding me that I should maybe do something about what's on my website. Okay, so let me just share some slides. Oh, let's see how everything's disappeared. So my talk today is going to be a little bit different to the standard talks that are usually held by Palaeoverse. So I'm going to talk about kind of a way of doing some science rather than some science that I've done. And so I was asked to talk about this because but both Bethany and Lewis and Will actually attended a hackathon that I ran in September of last year. And I think they were kind of interested in how the community might be able to use these more regularly to get stuff done. I should also apologize. There are a lot of really annoying GIFs in this. I managed to stop these from typing just before we started. Okay. Oh, and I guess the other kind of key role that I have is that I'm a senior editor at the journal Methods in Ecology and Evolution, which some of you might be aware of. So I work a lot with the British Ecological Society journals, and particularly, obviously, with methods. And so a lot of the stuff I'll talk about later is sort of in that context of the role I have within the journal. So starting off then of what is a hackathon? Essentially, it's a portmanteau word where it's two words joined together, basically. So it's hacking plus marathon is a hacking marathon. And it's worth pointing out when you say I want to run a hackathon, everybody panics that you're about to break into the mainframe and try and steal all the secrets. But actually, hacking's older use rather than that kind of nefarious use is actually a word that means exploratory programming. So when you're talking about hackathon, you're talking about exploratory programming. And specifically, it would be an event where people are engaging in rapid collaborative programming over a relatively short period of time. The idea actually comes from this kind of hilarious sort of toxic tech bro culture back in the 2010s, basically, where, get a bunch of bros down in a basement, sleeping very, very little, staying up all night, drinking beer, eating pizza, and hacking together various bits of software. And so this advert was on Eventbrite from 2014. Even then, that's clearly like the key demographic. It then kind of moved towards being a more community-based approach. There would be bigger groups of people doing them. And often they would have a prize for the best kind of output at the end. And again, I think prizes are fun, but probably also pushing this kind of slightly toxic side to these. So I'd say now that they're much nicer, so you could think of them more as global platforms for problem solving and collaboration. Less about prizes, more about community building and building skills and trust within those communities. So they're much more inclusive in terms of who participates, what the aims and scope might be, and also how the practice of how they're actually run. So regularly, sort of large, more commercialized type ones will often not just have coders, you might have designers, creatives as well. And so there are lots of really nice examples. And one of my favorites is the one that NASA runs every year, which is the International Space Apps Challenge, where they challenge people to come up with ideas that could be used in the space program or space exploration. Another really lovely one is Random Hacks of Kindness, which some of you may have got involved with in the past. So they choose a different theme every time they do this. And so I think one of the last ones was sort of writing apps that would help people with dementia. So thinking about ways of using programming skills for the good of the world. More closer to home in terms of what we might be familiar with, the British Ecological Society special interest groups run these quite regularly. This is just a picture that I found from one in 2020, but they have run some much more recently than that, I know. So this particular one was looking at building up tools for community science. And so everybody arrived, was given a set of different problems that they might try and solve, and then people get into groups and try and solve those problems programmatically. And not to forget that obviously Palaeoverse have had several of these. This is an advert for the one in 2023 at the Palace meeting, again, where people got together to talk about the kinds of R tools that people might need for paleo kind of analyses. And I think some of the stuff that was hacked together at that has then been incorporated into the lovely Palaeoverse R package and other R packages as well. So they can be a really nice, fun way of contributing to your community, especially if you have already quite solid programming skills. So why might you actually want to run a hackathon or go to one? In terms of why you might want to run one, I think the key thing is that you can use them to achieve more in a group setting than you could on your own. And I think you can think of this both in terms of like what you can achieve in terms of outputs. You can obviously do more if it's more than one person, but also in terms of thought processes. If you have a more diverse and more sort of bigger group of people, you're going to have different people with different ideas and different perspectives on a problem that's going to help you solve those things in a different way to how you would if you were doing this just you on your own in your room, or potentially just with your lab group or whatever. You can also use them if you've got a specific problem or set of problems you want to solve. But I think one thing that's becoming much more common is that using them to build community or to give back to a community that you've been part of. And you could also obviously use them to build your organizational leadership skills if you need something to put on your CV. And I think they're really fun. But I should acknowledge at this point that as my lab group like to tell me, my idea of fun is sometimes not everybody else's idea of fun, but I really enjoy running them and being part of them. Why you might want to attend one. I mean, I guess a main thing might be to gain specific skills in the topic of the actual hackathon, but you can also use them to more broadly develop skills like problem solving, critical thinking, and creativity, and also working in a team and thinking about how you might do things in a timely manner. They're great for expanding your network because you're going to meet different people. And it can also help you feel part of a community, particularly if it's something that not many people at your institution are working on. And again, it's a way of giving back to the community and having a good time. So I'm going to mostly end up focusing in this about like how we might run a hackathon. I'm going to give you kind of my, oh, sorry, there's somebody at my door. It's really loud. I'm just going to check what that is so that they don't do it again. I'm really sorry about that, everybody. I think they were trying to deliver a parcel to someone else, but the doorbell chime is like literally right where I'm sitting. So I apologize if that's just like deafened a bunch of people. Anyway, getting back to this. So how, oh my God. Sorry, I've pulled it out of the door. So how we might run a hackathon. I think there's probably multiple different ways that you can do this, and I don't think there is any one like true way of doing it. I'm just gonna give you an idea. Oh, you couldn't hear it. Okay, so it was really, really loud in my ear, the Little Mermaid theme tune, just to give you some understanding of what is going on in my house right now. So the how to run one, I think it can be really variable. I think you can do it in lots of different ways. And it wasn't until I started thinking about this yesterday that I was like, oh, is there a way that I would advise going about this? So I'm going to give you kind of like a set of steps that I would think about doing. I'll quickly just go through them in order, and then I'll specifically talk about a couple that I think are really important. And then I'll give you an example using this hackathon that we ran in September. And then obviously I'm really happy to chat and get questions. So how would I run a hackathon? So first thing I think is gathering together your core organizational team, who's going to be involved, and thinking about not only people who sort of share your kind of aims and values, but also are you missing anybody, any expertise that you might want to add in to the group in order to make it more sort of covering everything you want, and also trying to make things as inclusive as possible, I think is really important. Once you've done that, and this I think is a really key step, is thinking about what your aims and your goals are. And I think sometimes hackathons that don't go very well are ones where people haven't come up with a really, really clear and definable set of aims and goals that would, that are actually achievable and that can be sort of, ticked off or crossed off, however you want to kind of evaluate at the end. Then a good idea before you start the hackathon is to come up in your group, your sort of organizational team, with some kind of protocol or guidance document that will help put together the ideas of how you would go about this sort of the whole process. This might be really, really simple if you're just trying to give people like an idea of different questions that you might want to try and tackle, or it might be quite complicated. And I'll show you some of the stuff we put together for our hackathon, which is really complex, but that was because we were doing something quite involved. You then need to review and test that protocol and guidance document. And so making sure you send it around, obviously everyone in your group, but also some people outside the group to make sure that it makes sense and you're not missing anything important. And it's probably important at this point to also make sure that you have some kind of code of conduct attached to this. Then obviously going on to plan event practicalities, this will be the same as organizing any kind of seminar and workshop. I've put this in here just in case there are people who think they might want to organize it and maybe haven't organized anything before, just to give you some key things that you should think about when you're trying to organize any kind of event, really. Somebody's raised a hand. And then I'm going to talk about attracting. So then you probably want to attract and invite your participants and share information with them. And then you're going to need to actually run the hackathon. And then finally, I think some really important things is that you need to update participants about what actually was achieved and how things went, and also think about evaluating as an organizational team as to what went well and what could be done differently in future. And then finally, see if you've achieved your aims, which you may or may not have, and you may decide whether that's a problem or not. So something that I think is really key and that we sometimes struggle a bit with is thinking about deciding on our aims and goals. And so I think to start with, thinking about what you personally want to get out of a hackathon and also what you want participants to get out of it. And I think both of these need to be considered, because I think sometimes as early career researchers, it can be quite easy to try and want to give back to a community, but without thinking about your own needs and role, stuff that you need to gain. You're just doing something really altruistic. So I think it's important to make sure if you're running something that you're clear on what you're personally going to get out of it in terms of a paper or something to put on your CV or something like that. And you also need to think about what do you want participants to get out of it. So again, you shouldn't be horribly selfish and be like, well, I want to get a bunch of data for my PhD and I don't really care what the participants get. You do also need to think about how it's going to help participants gain skills or gain a paper or something as well. And so what you might want to get out could be specific outputs, could be a paper, could be a blog post, could be trying to solve a problem, could be thinking about making sure there's community engagement, you're building community. It might be to do with training people, or it might be trying to add experience to people's CVs. And one thing that you kind of need to think through before making your goals really specific is these things that will actually cause you to have to think a little bit carefully about what your goals should be. And these sort of things will affect your goals, and your goals will affect them. And also these factors are all sort of interacting with each other. So it gets a bit complicated, but just to give you an idea of what I mean. So one thing to consider at the beginning is like, how many attendees do you want? And this is a really important one. I've made the mistake of just saying, oh, it's great to have massive groups of people, and it is, but big groups can be really, really hard to manage, especially if this is the first time you've run something like this. So for a first time thing, I think 30 is probably the maximum people that is easy enough to deal with. Small groups are good because they can interact more, they have more individual input into the process. It also makes it easier if you've got mixed skill levels to mentor attendees. However, if you do that, you are going to have to limit numbers, which means people might get left out. So larger groups will ensure that they don't get left out, but it might be hard to manage. And they can get more done. So you can have more ambitious goals in terms of how much you want to get done if you've got a big group of people coming. You also want to know whether you're going to run your hackathon in person or hybrid. So in person is great for sort of networking and sort of building that community experience, whereas online it can be a little more difficult to do that. But online is cheap. In person, you're going to have to potentially pay for a venue, but certainly you're going to have to pay for food and teas and coffees. And online is also great because it means anyone can attend, no no matter where they are in the world, whether they have mobility issues that mean they possibly can't attend, or whether they have caring responsibilities or maybe can't afford to attend a hackathon. You do need to think carefully if you do online about tech solutions. And as I think we've all discovered over the last 5-6 years of doing this, that hybrid is both the best and worst of both worlds. You get some of the benefits, but you also get a lot of the negatives of both, and some extra negatives and positives as well. And then a final consideration is like, what skill level do you want your attendees to have? So when you're putting out adverts, are you asking for people who, for example, already have very good high level of coding in R, have already made R packages, so could help make new R packages? Or are you happy for people who just want to learn and kind of develop to come along as well? So beginners are obviously going to need more support, and that's going to reduce the ambition of your aims. Having advanced attendees is always excellent, and you can make your aims more ambitious, but there just aren't going to be that many people who have those advanced skills and are actually available to do things. So you're going to naturally have a smaller group of people if you sort of limit it to more advanced people. And it also really depends on what kind of community you're trying to build. Are you trying to really get stuff done and get high level research sort of questions done very quickly, or are you trying to build a community where you're building capacity for these kinds of things? And then the other thing I was going to specify is just thinking about practicalities. Like I said, this is probably completely obvious to anybody who's run an event before, but I recognize that not everybody will have. So thinking about booking where you're going to book a room to do this. And one thing that people often forget about is everybody will bring a laptop, and almost everybody will need to charge their laptop at some point during the day. So making sure there are plenty of plug sockets, or you've brought extension cables and a bit of gaffer tape to stick them to the ground so that people don't fall over them and kill themselves. Also, obviously, access to things like water and bathrooms. Ordering food and coffees can be an absolute nightmare in institutions I've worked in, but so it's something to really plan quite far in advance. This is something we discovered at the last hackathon I ran, which is that make sure the Wi-Fi is not only strong, but also works for the number of people that you intend to have working on it if you're going to have everybody doing stuff using the internet. Always think about accessibility. So obviously thinking about whether you might need lactation rooms, prayer rooms, quiet spaces, thinking very carefully about whether the room you have is accessible. Can anyone get there? Is the lift working? Those kinds of things. And also dietary requirements, of course, are a big part of accessibility as well. Making sure to cater for those. Making sure that you've shared information with your attendees in a timely manner so that people have time to plan. I know we're all really busy, but if you're sending information in the last week before something happens, that has consequences for people who need to make plans. And having a code of conduct is really important. I think most places have these now. Most conferences have them. You can usually just borrow one of those, but make sure you remind people at the beginning you will be using that code of conduct, and that you'll be following through if there are any issues. And you might want to organize something like a hackathon at a conference. And of course, if you're doing that, you'll need to work with the conference organizers to see if there are any additional things that you need to be aware of. On the other side of it, so virtual hackathons, hybrid hackathons, you need to think really carefully about how you're going to make that hackathon interactive, how are attendees going to communicate, how are they going to ask questions. In the past, we've done this using Discord and using Slack, and there are issues now with both of those platforms. So I genuinely right now don't know what I will use in future, because Discord has been brilliant for this, but I know they've now done some weird changes to their privacy settings, and you have to take a photograph of your face and it's all kind of horrible. So I don't know what we'll use in future. It's useful to still organize coffee breaks and lunch breaks so people can take time away from their computer, but also so that people can join a chat window and talk and network in the same way as in-person attendees. Again, similar stuff to before about the code of conduct and sharing information. For hybrid meetings, you need to try and think about how you'll try. It's really hard, but how will you at least try and make it a really good experience for both online and in-person attendees? And one thing I would recommend if you're doing a hybrid thing is to have at least one organizer who is just in charge of the online people, so that you don't end up being stuck trying to do two different jobs. So giving somebody that job works really well. Okay. Let me just check that everything's still working. Yes. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do then for the last sort of 10-15 minutes is just give you a really quick example of how we put this together for the BES Data and Code Hackathon that we ran at the end of September last year. And a massive thank you to all of the participants at this. I think some of them are in the audience. Certainly Will and Lewis were involved in that. So thank you to everybody who came along and everybody who contributed to this, because it was really good and really fun, and people were really, really engaged. So why did we want to do this? So like I said, I'm part of one of the journals at the British Ecological Society, but we actually have 7 journals, and we've had a data sharing mandate for longer than most other journals. So it's been in place since 2014. But, sit in the pub or at coffee breaks at conferences talking about, how useful actually is the data that's been shared? Are people just doing this as a tick box exercise, or are people actually engaging with the idea of data sharing? And then also, on top of that, what about code sharing, which has only been properly mandated for the last sort of 4 or 5 years and hasn't really taken off in some of the journals in the way that we'd hoped it had. So we decided we would collect some data and run some really sort of simple kind of analyses and summaries to understand how that was working. And we thought, wouldn't it be fun if we tried to get lots of people involved and to see how much data we could actually get doing this as a hackathon? So hang on, as somebody pointed out to me, I'm like, this is super helpful pointing out this out to me after I've agreed to give a talk on what is a hackathon. Like, is this actually a hackathon? Good point. I suppose in theory, we didn't do any hacking. We mostly collected data. So it really was probably more a datathon. But do we care? I don't know if it really matters. I mean, I just think hackathon is a better word than datathon. But anyway. Just in case that was worrying people. So what do we do? This is, again, like the routine that we went through. So we got together a core organizational team. So me, some people from the BES, some of the associate editors at Methods in Ecology and Evolution. And then I bumped into Bethany at a conference and roped her into it as well, because she's been a data editor at Proceedings B. And so I thought she'd have really good insight into how we should put this together. So obviously the aims were to think about how effective data and code sharing had been. I think inclusivity and transparency is really important. So we wanted to allow anybody who wanted to be involved, and also to collect as much data as we could in a short period of time. The planned output was to have a big data set, but also a paper that we could submit to Methods in Ecology and Evolution, plus additional potential papers if there were side projects that people came up with. And the nature, therefore, of these goals and this kind of interactive framework was that we knew it was going to be a large meeting. It was larger than we were expecting. We had 130 people show up overall. So I think about 60 of those in person and everyone else online, which was a lot bigger than we were expecting. And that came with some challenges, but also some real positives as well. Obviously, it meant we needed it to be hybrid because we wanted to make sure anyone could attend. And it also meant it was going to be mixed ability. So we had people from undergraduate students right up to very senior professors and software professionals and research librarians, and all kinds of different people came along. And although most people were in the ecology evolution sphere, there were also people from all kinds of different backgrounds as well. So it was a really interesting opportunity to network with lots of really different cool people. So the protocol was actually pretty tricky to put together. We ended up with a full protocol. So essentially, we're trying to tell people, I want you to collect this information, this information, this information, and then giving them as detailed explanation of what exactly we meant by those things as we could in the protocol. Then we also made a Google form for data entry. This is a really good idea because it means you can create drop-down menus and multiple choice menus, which means that data input errors are reduced. And we did have quite a few write-in options because people kept saying, well, this isn't really covered. I would say be a little bit careful of that because people like to rather than making a decision one way or the other, people were writing kind of essays about what they thought the answer should be, when really the answer should have just been yes or no. So just be a bit wary about that. And then we also had a separate Google form for GDPR. Because of GDPR issues, you don't want to be sharing people's email addresses and saving people's email addresses as far as possible. So we had another form to collect people's information. So their email address, and also things like people's ORCID ID and address, and affiliation, so that we didn't have to recollect that data for the paper. We also had a list of all the papers that have been published in the BES between 2017 and 2024, excluding reviews and things that we thought wouldn't use data or code. And we also had to set up a Discord site with certain channels, and we put all the information into those channels as well. So this was a very involved and long process, which resulted in a big, I'm really happy to share these documents with anybody as well if people want to see how this was done. So this is just the 15-page sort of the table of contents for the protocol and the kinds of things we had. And just an example, like here was a question that was just a multiple choice one, and we just listed all of the options. And then for some of the more sort of vague questions, which were harder to get consistency on, we tried to give people like a demonstration of what a good README, for example, should include, and then we got people to choose between 1 and 10 where they thought that fell. And so then we had these input files, one for the actual data, one that people only had to fill in once with their information, and then we also had the Discord with a load of different channels set up, each for slightly different things as we worked through stuff. Reviewing and testing the protocol, we thought we'd done a good job of this, and it turns out that we probably should have done more. So we all checked it several times. I also got my lab to run through the protocol on 2 separate occasions, and they didn't have any problems with it. It was all fine. We sent it out 2 weeks before the hackathon, and a few people sent us feedback. And on the first day of the hackathon, the plan was to spend a couple of hours at the start to do some final checks and then start collecting data from about noon. Unfortunately, it turned out people had a lot of things that they were unhappy with in the protocol and that were confused by, which we just couldn't deal with everything in that very short 2-hour period because of another problem, which I'll come back to in a second. So what we should have done is told people to actually look at that beforehand and get back to us beforehand rather than on the day. But what was really useful is having everything online so that we could update things as we needed to, as we were going along, without having to like resend people out different Word documents and stuff. I won't go into the event practicalities because this is just like organizing an event. But one thing just to highlight is the online attendees had 2 organizers who were just in the online chat rooms the entire time. And so they were just dealing with online stuff. And then there were 2 of us in person who were just dealing with people in person. And so that was, I think, a good split to make sure everybody was around. In terms of attracting attendees, I'm sure everybody's noticed that getting people to sign up to stuff has gotten much harder since Twitter has kind of died and nobody's using that anymore. We did try socials, so we shared this via Instagram and Blue Sky and things like that. BES sent it out on their mailing list. Sortie sent it out on their mailing list, and various special interest groups the BES sent it out. So, we obviously were reaching the right people because we had so many people sign up. But I know it's getting harder to attract people, especially if you're looking for advanced people. In terms of running it, as usual, I feel like every event I run turns into organized chaos, but I kind of enjoy that. So like I said, the plan was to review the protocol from 10 till 12, and I was just going to fix things online whilst everybody else dealt with all the other things that were going on. Unfortunately, what happened was at 10 a.m., the Wi-Fi went down at the BES because it couldn't cope with the number of people that were using it in the basement for the hackathon. And so none of us were able to access any of the documents or Discord. So poor old Graziella and Bethany had to work. They did an incredible job trying to answer the questions of people online, whilst none of us could actually access anything. And we couldn't update any of the protocol until we fixed that. And so we ended up only really having an hour to fix things. like I said, there were a lot of edits. A couple of people sent me about a couple of A4 pages of edits that there just wasn't time to fix some of those things. And some of them were things that people want to add that were a bit too complex for the users, the people, like the audience who were there to actually do. So we basically couldn't fix some of that stuff, but we did what we could. And then after that, everything was totally fine, I think. Okay, and then in terms of updating people, we did preliminary data visualizations of the results so that we could show people before the end of the second day some of the results, and people were really happy because that meant people saw feedback immediately on goals. We also sent feedback via email and via Discord. We sent initial results out, and since then we've also sent around the draft of the paper that's going to be submitted. I'm just waiting on people's comments, which I'll incorporate next week, and then we'll hopefully get it submitted to Methods in Ecology and Evolution. So finally then, did we achieve our aims? Yes, I think we did. We had really engaged participants, both online and in person. Really, like, loads of really positive feedback. I think it's probably the most engaged I've ever seen an online meeting. Like, people were genuinely like chatting, asking questions, talking to each other, making suggestions, just having really interesting conversations and debates that I ended up having to reread, like reading through them afterwards in the end. But there was tons of really, really interesting interaction on Discord as well as in person. And so I think people also felt like they got to meet a lot of interesting people, and they also learned how to share their own code and data more effectively, which was again part of our aims. We ended up collecting data on about 20% of the papers that were published within that time window, which is huge. So the people from Salty were saying the most they've ever managed to process, and usually over a longer period with a more expert set of assessors, has been about 500 papers. So this is like a really big chunk to have some analyses on. And like I said, we're about to submit the paper. So in terms of what I would do differently next time, like I said, main issues were related to the sheer number of participants. But, there were a lot of questions because there were a lot of people, but it was great to see that engagement. One thing that we did discover is people interpret things in quite different ways, and that's really hard to fix. We tried and tried to write things, but some people will just interpret things differently, and that's kind of okay. And write-in boxes are the absolute worst. And so my favorite example was one person who managed to write their own name in 6 different ways in the course of a day. So that meant there was a huge amount of data cleaning that took me a lot longer than I was expecting. So as I already said, I would make sure that the participants actually checked the protocol at least a week before and then sent us any edits. I think we need to be clearer that it was meant to be, all the questions should have been possible for everybody. I think some of the more advanced attendees wanted to add more complex stuff, and that confused people a little bit. I would have a plan for what would happen if the internet went down, because I was not expecting that, and that was quite the exciting change. And I would probably get people to do more papers that were the same so we could check for consistency. So we got everyone to do one paper that everybody did, but it would have been useful to have a couple to see if it was like a consistent issue where people were doing things differently. To avoid writing boxes where I could, I'd set aside more time for data cleaning. And I think I thought very carefully about how to delegate the planning stages and the actual hackathon, but I hadn't thought very carefully about how I would delegate stuff after the hackathon. And so a lot of that kind of follow-up and stuff has ended up falling to me, which has ended up being a lot of work and delayed things a lot because I'm obviously very busy. So I would think about that a bit more carefully next time. And one tiny thing I just want to add before we do questions is that I don't think it would be completely legitimate to talk about hackathons without saying there are some criticisms of hackathons. So they've been shown to be actually quite ineffective as long-term solutions. So there's a study done in the US, and they found only 7% of projects had any activity after 6 months. So they do seem to create what they call vaporware rather than software, so stuff that's used briefly and then not really embedded. Whether that's necessarily a huge problem or not is something to think about. I think it is key that it's really hard to finish something if you're doing a 2-day hackathon. So you do need people to stay engaged to actually finish stuff, which can be really difficult and also requires organizers to have a plan for how to do that follow-up as well. And a really key thing is you are using unpaid labor. So it can be very exploitative. It's probably less of an issue in academia, but certainly when there are like commercial hackathons where they'll then use those products without. So it's just a way of getting a lot of stuff done without having to pay anybody and pretending that you're giving them something useful. So solutions then, make it clear who's in charge of the follow-up and make sure follow-up happens. You don't want people to feel like they didn't get what they wanted out of it because nobody ever followed up with them. And maybe outputs aren't so important. If your aim was community building, then you might have still built a community without actually having anything really like physical to show for it at the end. And then make sure that the attendees are gaining what they expected to. So if you said they were going to get a paper out of it, they get a paper out of it. So I feel like I shouldn't have to say this, but don't exploit people. Like that's not okay. Okay, and then that is my ramble. Does anyone have any questions?